I took the liberty of changing the title that was originally allocated to me. It was meant to be Transforming Adaptation in Southeast Asian Coastal Cities. But instead I felt it was worth looking at informality as a particularly critical issue that shapes both the nature of risk and the way in which we're going to need to respond to climate risk in coastal cities, but also in cities more generally in low and middle income countries. And to do that I'm going to address 3 points briefly in my comments. The first being to give a summary of some of the key findings from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the IPCC Special Report on 1.5 degrees, or global warming of 1.5 degrees, and what that means specifically for cities and informal settlements. We're going then to look a little bit at the relationship between informality, both informal settlements and the informal economy, and how that shapes the nature of risk in cities. And then I'm going to try and conclude with some thoughts on how we might address informality in a way that builds resilience, so engaging constructively with informality to respond to climate change threats. So the most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change only came out a few weeks ago in October, a special report on what 1.5 degrees would look like of global warming and how that would compare with the 2 degrees of global warming, which is the current global commitment, and an assessment of whether or not we're on track to reach that 2-degree commitment. And I think one of the things that's been covered extensively in the media is firstly that we are not on track even to meet the 2-degree commitment, but secondly that there's going to be a substantial climate impact even in a 2-degree world, which could be reduced somewhat if we attempt more ambitious targets around 1.5 degrees. So this is a broader framing of the issues of climate change and a broader understanding that the way in which we tackle greenhouse gas emissions in the coming years is going to have significant implications for the cities and for the people living in cities in Asia and indeed in many other places that are exposed to climate-related hazards. So these are some of the conclusions from that report which do relate specifically to urban areas. And global warming of 2 degrees is expected to pose greater risks to urban areas than global warming of 1.5 degrees. But perhaps more significantly for our seminar that focuses on social development, the extent of risk depends on human vulnerability and the effectiveness of adaptation for regions, informal settlements and infrastructure sectors, and that there's really high confidence in this conclusion. And so because of this, building resilience for residents of low-income and informal settlements is increasingly urgent. And really I think it's remarkable that increasingly within IPCC reports there is this recognition of poverty and informality in cities as being one of the real frontiers where it's going to be necessary to reduce risk. So as we're talking about then, if we're looking at informal settlements, we can have our formal definitions of informal settlements. Urban settlements are neighbourhoods that are outside the formal system for recording land ownership and tenure, and that do not meet a range of regulations related to planning and land use, built structures, health and safety. Now, of course, for many cities throughout Africa and South Asia, Southeast Asia, informality is almost the normal state of affairs. Cities have been growing in an unplanned way. Settlements have been developed in areas which were never planned or identified for formal housing, within the formal planning framework of the city. And this responds to people's very legitimate and logical needs for places to live that are both affordable and accessible to livelihood earning opportunities. And that's why we see these sorts of large numbers, and somewhere 900 million people worldwide living in informal settlements. This vast proportion of the urban population in sub-Saharan Africa and a considerable proportion in South Asia as well. And like anything, we need to recognise that there's variety within these informal settlements, that there are power relations among people who are structure owners or people who are tenants, and there's power relations around gender and age, There's power relations around the level of illegality. Even if things are outside the formal recognised system, there can be different levels of worry that people have about the security of their tenure. And I think it's also worth making the point of the significance of displaced people and refugees within some of these informal settlements, as well as a particularly vulnerable group. One of the things which is striking in the humanitarian crises of recent years is that how much increasingly the refugees and IDPs are living in towns and cities instead of in refugee camps, and these are a particular group that face challenges in these settlements. And then just some graphs showing even as the efforts and attention to these informal settlements increases, the absolute numbers of people who are living in slums, and this is a slightly different definition coming from the UN Habitat and deprivations that they identify to determine whether a location is a slum or not. We can see these numbers increasing in Eastern Asia, very high in Southern Asia, but going up extremely rapidly and still in sub-Saharan Africa. And many of the people who live in informal settlements, of course, work in the informal economy. Much of this is concentrated in informal settlements, and again has a wide range of manifestations, from people who are working in unincorporated small enterprises to people who are working in informal employment like domestic work or transport or some other service economy. And often the informal settlements and the informal economy bring somehow problems within the city, because of course they're incredibly important drivers of city economies. The workforce from informal neighbourhoods is significant, and the integration between the informal economy and what we term the formal economy is significant as well. And so we need to consider then how these characteristics of the informal settlements and the informal economy interact with risk. And a lot of this, of course, is to do with the location of these settlements. I'm sure we'll hear much more detailed case studies, settlements that are located on hill slopes, settlements that are located alongside riverbanks, settlements, as we can see at the bottom, very common throughout South and Southeast Asia and in coastal areas. So what some of my colleagues and I have been trying to do is really to dig into this relationship between poverty, informality and climate risk in a lot more detail, to look at what the particular climate impacts will be in cities, and to look at what those, what the potential changes in climate are going to be, what the impacts will be in cities, and then how those will have particular impacts for residents of informal settlements or working in the informal economy. So if we take things like, for example, higher and increasing simple extremes in temperature, the effects of that increase in temperature will vary greatly depending on the quality of housing that people live in. We're about to publish a paper in the journal Environment and Urbanisation, which we produced, that shows a 5 or 6 degree difference in temperature within one city in India, depending on whether you're living in a formal house with green space around it, or living in an informal settlement in an uninsulated and poorly constructed house. And so these higher temperatures will have different effects on people depending on the part of the city they're living in, and depending on the quality of the housing that they're living in. Or if we look at things like more gradual changes, and if we take sea level rise as an example here, again, as we'll hear about through this seminar, the people living in coastal areas at low elevation coastal zones without protected infrastructure are going to be more affected by sea level rise, which is again often places without the protected infrastructure and with poor quality housing. So there's a growing recognition that informality is significant, and this is a figure that came out of the IPCC Cities Conference earlier this year, and it tries to put forward a research and action agenda on climate change in cities. And it adopts one of the general principles that we see for climate change responses in cities, which is to take a systems approach to highlight the interconnectedness between different actions and activities and topics and themes within a city. And really for the first time, informality has been recognised as being one element which needs to be engaged with to build the resilience of urban areas. But what does that mean in practice? And I'm drawing here on examples that we have from working with grassroots networks of the urban poor who have been trying over decades now to use things like savings groups and the gathering of information at the community level through enumerations as a basis for better local development that's responsive to the needs of people living in informal settlements, and it's increasingly beginning to recognise the dimensions of risk, including future risk associated with climate change. So the IPCC certainly recognises that risk-reducing infrastructure and services and better quality housing are central to reducing risks from extreme weather. But this requires careful processes of community participation and the driving of decisions around the appropriate ways to do informal settlement upgrading, the circumstances in which relocation is necessary, and the ways in which relocation can be done in practice. It responds both to a realistic assessment of current and future risks, but also a realistic assessment of the livelihood opportunities that are available to people and the capacities to pay for new housing or different areas of land. It requires engaging with things like social protection, requires engaging with things like the sharing of information, where often the practices that have been used around formal processes for risk reduction haven't been sufficiently driven by community priorities. And it requires financial support, and I'll come back to that briefly in a second. But of course the priorities for people living in informal settlements are seldom sufficiently simple just to be captured within the broad remit of climate change responses. And so if we try to map out some of the different areas in which informal settlement upgrading is necessary, what we can then try to do is identify some of the benefits that this generates for health, many of these health issues being associated with changes in the climate as well, and for livelihoods and income, and for climate change responses. And so this is preliminary work that's being done with colleagues in Kenya, in a slum called Bukuru, the second largest slum in Nairobi, to try and identify how planning for informal settlement upgrading in these areas of transport, energy, housing, livelihoods and neighbourhoods can contribute to these different sorts of goals. So I'm really just showing this as a work in progress and something that's being actively developed to make the case for stronger support for neighbourhood level upgrading as a component of resilience. And this will require financing as well. And we have a reasonably strong acceptance that improving neighbourhood level infrastructure and housing is critical to resilience among local governments. Very strong acceptance of this among the research community, but as yet very little acceptance of this among the climate change finance community. And so I think a lot of the research and evidence that some of us here are trying to build is to demonstrate the need for climate finance to be allocated to community level, neighbourhood level upgrading in ways that learns from how decentralised finance, alternative methods of decision making around how funds are spent, has been shown to be both economically more effective and more effective in meeting the goals when communities are involved in a detailed way in that planning and decision-making process. So I think that's an appropriate place to end as a sort of call for action around making the case for why climate finance needs to take urban informality seriously.